Leonardo Oliveira Martins, and he's going to talk about gene.
I'm going to talk about species tree inference. And thank you all for coming. I would like to start by thanking the help from Klaus Schlieb, Matheus Patricio, and Nicolas Laftillo for their help in several aspects of this work, which is the estimation of the distribution of species trees given gene family information. And our assumption, so this is a very simplistic model, and it assumes that the disagreement between the gene tree and the species tree can be summarized by the distance. So the probability will be proportional to the similarity between the gene tree and the species tree. This is the model of, this is the maximal likelihood supertree paper by Steele and Rodrigo. And the only difference is that in our case, we work with multivariate exponential distribution, which means that we can work with several sources of disagreement, several distances. And instead of the Robinson's fold distance, which was their case. And by the way, we assume we are restricted to distances that can work with multilabeled gene trees, which are those gene trees where more than one leaf can map to the same species. So we couldn't use the Robinson's fold, but now there's a solution for that. And we also work with unrooted trees. We don't want to assume we know the root position. So how do we quantify this agreement? What are the distances? Well, we know how to calculate the minimum number of incomplete linear sorties necessary to explain the difference between the gene tree and the species tree for any pair of gene and species trees. We also know how to calculate and map the most parsimonious reconciliation in terms of duplication and losses. We also developed an approximation to the SPR distance, which could be a good proxy for horizontal heat transfer. But since our algorithm doesn't work with MU3, so I won't talk about it here. And we can also, think about other non-parametric distances, which are Robinson's fold distance, triplet distance, quartet distance, and here we'll show results using the MURF. So now we know how to calculate the probability of an alignment given the phylogenetic model and the gene tree, and we also know how to calculate the probability of a gene tree given the species tree, which is given by these lambda parameters from the explanation. These are penalties. This is the complete, the posterior probability will be proportional to this, but in our case, we leave to the user to do the heavy lifting, and so we assume that the user already calculated. We won't calculate the phylogenetic likelihoods. So we assume that the user already applied Mr. Bayes, Beast, or Philo Bayes, and then it gives as an input to the program the distribution of gene trees, assuming independence. And then what we will have as the output will be the posterior probability of the species trees and the posterior probability of the gene trees, which will be a reweighted version of the input that the user gave to the program. So thanks to Diego, I don't need to explain this. I'll just say that I use it SIM5, but in my case, I was also interested in duplication and losses, so I also use a broad range of parameters. We did 20,000 replicates where the species tree was simulated under the coalescent or under a pure-bird process. And then using SIM5, we have the true gene trees. Once we have the true gene trees, the proper way of doing this would be to simulate the unalignment using indelible, for instance, and then using Mr. Bayes to estimate the posterior probability. But in our case, these trees can have thousands of taxa. This would be impossible. So we did a quick and dirty approximation to this. I won't go into details. It's just that it's enough to say that I apply branch swaps on short branches, and then I emulate the behavior of Mr. Bayes or the phylogenetic Bayesian methods. I also don't need to explain this into detail. Just to say that for each replicate, once we have our simulated data set, we try to estimate the species tree using distance matrix methods like the GLASS, STAKE, MAC, SD, and we also tried IDTP using both the duplication and loss cost and the deep coalescence cost, and we also use our program, of course. And so this is the basic result that we observed. So enough about the model, so let's see some results. So this is the result over the more than 20,000 replicates. This is the violin plot of the accuracy in the estimation of the species tree. By accuracy, I mean the proportion of nodes from the true tree that were successfully reconstructed by the method. So as we can see, well, we have a Bayesian method, so we have a posterior distribution of species trees. So if you take the consensus of this posterior distribution, or if you take the maximum a posteriori tree, or if you take the average accuracy between all trees present in the posterior distribution, guenomu, our program, will give the best accuracy, which is followed very, very closely by IGTP when you use the duplication and loss cost. We'll see, okay, we have time, we can see in more detail this, how they fare. But just to say that then if you use IGTP, but using the incomplete linear sorting cost, the deep coalescence cost, it doesn't fare very well, but still fare better than all the distance matrix methods. But this is not their fault. This is because they assume that the incongruence between the gene tree and species tree comes from the coalescent, and we are simulating with a lot of duplications and with a lot of losses. And so this is just to look with a bit more detail into the results that we observe. So here I'm plotting the consensus accuracy, so considering the accuracy for our program, and which here it's DILR. Anyways, the green and the red one, it's our program, it's guenomu. And we also have the result for IGTP using the best accuracy. So if basically it's the duplication and loss cost, but in some cases, if the incomplete linear sorting cost gave a better result, then that's the value that we use. And this is just to show that when the species trees are simulated under a pure board process, under a Ewing process, basically the accuracy is very good for any number of, for any species tree size. So as you increase the species tree size, everything is going to be more complicated. So not only the species tree will be larger, but the gene families will be much, much larger. But still, the estimation works well. If we simulate under the coalescent process, the Kingman process, then you start to see this decrease in performance when you have larger species trees. So why am I plotting this? Because David wants to use this, because he says this is the biologically realistic simulation. So he says that if you, well, the proper way of simulating a species tree is through a pure birth process or that process. But I want to see the results where the methods fail. So I want to see, even if it's unrealistic, I want to see hard cases. And for this, if you remember well, under the coalescence process, the thing is that here you have at least one or a few branches which will be very, very short. And so the speciation between them is going to be very short. So in this case, most certainly you have incomplete linear sorting, in some cases a lot of them, and that's why you see the decreasing performance for all methods. So if you really want to simulate difficult cases, go for the coalescent. And then, so this is a little bit complicated too. Well, this is the distribution of accuracies for IGTP paired with guenomu. So for instance, in this case here, we pulled all samples which have more than 60 species. And then we look at the accuracy, we look at the distribution of the accuracies. So for the species tree simulated under the coalescent, we can see that, maybe you can see that the number here is 0.11. This means that 11% of all the samples, IGTP gave an accuracy larger than 0.8. While for our case, this number was 0.15. So it's marginally better. I don't want to say too much about this. I prefer to say that they're equivalent. But just remembering that for these hard cases, our program might be a little bit better. And so our program does not only estimate the posterior distribution of species trees, but it also estimates the posterior distribution of gene trees. And so, for instance, what I'm showing here is the input gene seed distributions. I'm showing the distributions that we give to the simulator. So it's the simulation of Mr. Bayes, if you want. Just to show how this is for the consensus trees for each one of these for these gene family distributions. And this is the accuracy of the map trees. How can we interpret this? Well, as the number of species, I forgot to put a label here, but this is the number of species. As the number of species increases, then the consensus of the input gene seed distributions, it decreases a lot. This I'm talking just about the simulation, not about guenomu, not about the program. But the map trees are always good. This is a schematic representation. I think that the distribution is something like this. So you have a long tail, and the true tree is around here. Its frequency, it's not very large. But anyway, you guys can tell me, but I think this is a little bit worse than usually what we have with Philo Bayes, Mr. Bayes. So again, I'm on the safe side. I want to see the hard cases. And then I'm going to show now the posterior distribution of gene trees. So this is the estimate of the program. So you can see that the consensus trees and the map trees are very good. For the easy cases, when you have few species, then the program is not so good to estimate the true gene tree as the map. But as you know, when you look at the distribution, it's not a good idea to look only at the map tree, only at the map point, but you look at the map, look at the consensus. If you have other summary information, use all this kind of summary information. This is just to show that if you're familiar with Bucky, so our program is doing something similar to Bucky. It's decreasing the uncertainty on the estimation of gene trees. So we will, you run an analysis with Mr. Bayes or Philo Bayes, and then, but you still have a lot of uncertainty, and then you can apply our algorithm, and our algorithm will decrease the uncertainty because it's using information from other gene families. And yeah, so these are just other measures. So for instance, this is the accuracy between each one of the trees. So if you look at the frequency of the true tree, which would be this value here or this value here. So the input is around 0.3, but in the output it grows. So each replicate has several gene families. It has between 3 and 50 gene families. And so this is the proportion of the gene families where the most frequent tree is the true tree. So for the hard cases, our program can construct better. For easy cases, I think it doesn't matter. And that's it.
It's time for 1-2 questions while we change over. Yes?
So for the duplication and loss part of the model, you assume that you know the person's reference.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear.
What?